What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Who was England's first king? Scholars say Athelstan was likely the first king of England. However, his rise to power is a complicated story. Athelstan is regarded by scholars as the first genuine king of England. What, however, makes a king? Is it authority over people? Is it land? Is it some combination of the two? These are some of the key questions in assessing when and why any monarchy develops. At the same time, these same questions often serve to complicate the identification of the first king of any realm. We need not look further than England to understand why. In 925 AD, Athelstan was crowned king of the Anglo-Saxons. However, answering the deceptively straightforward question of who was the first king of England requires a deeper comprehension of the other contenders for that title, as well as the history of the various kingdoms that became England. Establishing a realm for a king. To really begin to locate the first king of England, one must start with the Angles. The name England, after all, derives from the Old English word Engleland, literally land of the Angles. During the 5th century AD, these Germanic tribes made their way to Britannia, which was once part of the Roman province. Through the 6th century, the Angles, along with the Jutes, Saxons and Frisians, established settlements in the southeast and east of England. With time, Germanic language and culture melded with existing Romano-British practices and traditions. By 600 AD, individual kingdoms took shape throughout the British Isles. These Germanic kingdoms were formed in accordance with peoples living in an area, as opposed to physical boundaries or borders. The heptarchy was formed when smaller kingdoms came together to form larger ones over time. The 7 kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, Northumbria, Essex, Wessex, and Mercia comprise the heptarchy, which is a vast oversimplification of an intricate social, political, and religious setting in England. There were minor kingdoms within each major kingdom that had their own leaders and competed for power within the larger sphere of influence. Rule was established and maintained through reciprocal relationships based in loyalty and protection, as well as an economic system contingent upon coordinated dues and services. Contenders for England's throne throughout much of the 8th century, major kingdoms in England fought for superiority among themselves, resulting in Mercia's dominance over the other kingdoms. This was similar to what Bede wrote about in his Ecclesiastical History, which he wrote in 731 AD, where he said that Bede was a ruler who had power over people outside his own kingdom. This idea was represented by the term Bretwalda in the 9th century Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which applied it retroactively to Anglo-Saxon kings who ruled as early as the late 5th century. Mercia's hegemony shifted during the reign of King Egbert of Wessex r. 802–839 AD. Under King Egbert, Wessex defeated the Mercians at the Battle of Elendon in 825 AD, after which the major kingdoms acknowledged his supremacy. King Egbert's candidacy for first king of England is centered on the fact that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle identified him as a Bretwalda, again with the ability to see things from a distance. King Egbert's claim to being England's first king was influenced by yet another factor. Where Mercia had struggled with the idea of peaceful succession, Wessex succeeded. After Egbert's death, his son, Ethelwulf d. ascended to the throne in 850 AD. In Wessex, the principle of hereditary succession was infused by a son ascending to the throne upon his father's death. Following King Ethelwulf's death, 3 of his sons served as king of Wessex, ultimately leading to the accession of a 4th in 871 AD. This was Alfred, another person who was thought to be a candidate for the first king of England. Alfred, the unlikely king. Alfred was never supposed to rule Wessex. When his older brother Ethelred died while campaigning against Scandinavian marauders, Alfred became king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to Alfred as King of Wessex because he continued to defend his kingdom from the great heathen army. Comprising Danes, Norwegians and Swedes, the Great Heathen Army first arrived in East Anglia in 865 AD, and within a decade, the only kingdom they left standing was Wessex. Alfred signed a peace treaty with their leader, Guthrum, after defeating Scandinavian forces at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD, formally establishing a boundary between Wessex and the Viking-ruled areas. The latter came to be known as the Danelaw. However, Alfred decided to take measures to protect the kingdom in response to the ongoing Viking incursions and raids, as well as the permanent Scandinavian presence in the north. He reformed the military, established defensive settlements called Buzz, and established a navy to defend the coasts of Wessex from attacks. Alongside these efforts, Alfred undertook intellectual activities that have been credited with helping to create the cultural and political identity of England. All of this, in addition to the fact that charters attributed to Alfred name him King of the Anglo-Saxons, supports his claim to be the first King of England. The first King of England, Aethelstan Alfred, died in 899 AD and his son, Edward the Elder, took the throne. Edward died in 924 and after his demise, his son Aethelstan was crowned king in 925 AD. Aethelstan was king of the Anglo-Saxons from the beginning, just like his father and grandfather, Alfred the Great. His domain was different, especially after the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD. Aethelstan's authority was never uncontested, and, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he spent the decade after he became king bringing York and Northumbria under his control. By 937 Welsh kings, as well as those of the Scots and Viking Dublin, united against Aethelstan, ultimately facing off against their common foe at Brunanburh. The exact location of Brunanburh remains unclear, but the fight that took place there is considered by many scholars to be one of the defining events in British history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle includes a poem about the Battle of Brunanburh that details how West Saxons slaughtered their enemies, with 5 opposing kings and 7 defiant earls laying dead. The poem explains how no slaughter yet was greater made e'er in this island, an expression of how devastating yet significant the conflict was to the people and land alike. Aethelstan holds the majority of the evidence, despite the arguments in their favor. It was Aethelstan who went to York, defeated the Viking kingdom there, and brought the north if sometimes only nominally under English rule, summarizes Carl Shoemaker, Robert F. and Sylvia T. Wagner, Distinguished Professor of History and Law at UW-Madison. He had achieved more administrative and bureaucratic centralization by the end of his reign than any of his predecessors. It was Aethelstan's victory at Brunanburh that extended the king of the Anglo-Saxons' dominion into Scotland and Wales. It also solidified his rule as King of the English. Even though Aethelstan only lived for 2 years after the fight, many people believe that his victory made him the real first king of England. Scholars overwhelmingly agree that Aethelstan was the first true king of England, but like many things rooted in deep antiquity, the truth is more complicated than a name and a date. Rather, it is a layered story of tribal migrations, fractured kingdoms, contested titles, dynastic succession, and a brutal struggle for power and unity across centuries of chaos and conquest. It is necessary to trace the roots of English identity itself, not only political but also linguistic, cultural and geographic, and to recognize that kingship is not just a matter of lineage or power but also a matter of consensus, reach, and legacy in order to comprehend why Aethelstan is given the title of England's first king rather than someone else like his grandfather Alfred the Great or the powerful Egbert of Wessex. England comes from Englaland, which means land of the Angles, a Germanic tribe that came to Britain after the Romans left Britannia in the 5th century AD. The Angles, along with other Germanic groups like the Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, established bases in the southeast and east of the island. They gradually overtook or absorbed the native Romano-British populations, and by the 6th century, a jumble of competing kingdoms had emerged. These were not the neatly bounded states of today. Rather, they were ethnically and kin-based territories ruled by warlords and kings whose legitimacy was based on oaths of loyalty, military prowess, and reciprocal bonds of protection rather than on bureaucratic systems. Over time, some kingdoms came to dominate others, and from this shifting landscape emerged what historians later termed the Heptarchy, 7 powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, Northumbria, Essex, Wessex, and Mercia. Although the concept of the Heptarchy is a useful framework, it flattens a much more complicated reality of overlapping claims, frequent invasions, dynastic feuds, and a lack of centralized rule, making it extremely difficult to determine who was truly the first in any meaningful way. For much of the 8th century, Mercia was the most powerful kingdom, with rulers like Offa establishing hegemony over other kings and territories, but it was Egbert of Wessex r. 802–839 AD who broke Mercia's dominance, defeating its army at the Battle of Ellendun in 825 and claiming supremacy over much of southern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the 9th century, retrospectively called Egbert of Bretwalda, an Old English term meaning Britain ruler or wide ruler, denoting a king whose authority stretched beyond his own people. While the term didn't necessarily mean King of England as we understand it, it signaled a crucial shift toward territorial unification. Egbert's consolidation of power and the peaceful succession of his son Ethelwulf d. 858 introduced a principle of hereditary monarchy, uncommon at the time and an important step toward the idea of a single English kingship. Ethelwulf's descendants Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred I, and finally Alfred would all rule Wessex in turn, but it was Alfred the Great, who reigned from 871 to 899, who arguably came closest to establishing a unified English monarchy before Aethelstan. After his brother Ethelred I passed away, Alfred assumed the throne at a crucial time when the Viking-led Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Norse warriors, had conquered or destabilized nearly every Anglo-Saxon kingdom, with the exception of Wessex. By defeating the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred turned the tide. He forced their leader Guthrum to become a Christian and accept a treaty that established a new border between the Danelaw to the north and east and Alfred's Wessex to the south and west. Alfred used the relative peace to reform his military, establish fortified towns known as Buzz, and construct a navy to defend against future Viking attacks, despite the fact that this division of land limited his authority. Even more enduring were Alfred's intellectual efforts, translating Latin texts into Old English, founding schools, and promoting a sense of English Christian identity rooted in law, literacy and faith. He even went by the name King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that showed how far he wanted to go beyond Wessex. However, despite his fame and accomplishments, Alfred did not control all of England. Some areas remained under Viking rule, while others, like Mercia, maintained some degree of independence. Upon Alfred's death, his son Edward the Elder inherited the throne and, along with his sister Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, embarked on a campaign to reclaim territory from the Danes. Wessex and Mercia had become more or less united under Edward's rule by the time he died in 924. Edward's son, Aethelstan, was crowned in 925 and immediately faced challenges to his legitimacy. The Norsemen's ensconcement in Northumbria and the formation of alliances between Scots, Irish Norse, and Welsh rulers against any southerly centralized power kept the political landscape still volatile. But Aethelstan, more than any of his predecessors, methodically consolidated control over the entirety of England as we recognize it today. He took York in 927, bringing the Viking-ruled north into his fold, and began issuing charters not only as King of the Anglo-Saxons but as Rex Anglorum King of the English. Aethelstan enforced royal authority by summoning nobles and clergy to royal councils, standardizing law codes, issuing coinage, and promoting Christian unity across his dominion. His court became a center of learning and international diplomacy, hosting envoys from the Frankish, German, and Norse worlds. The defining moment of his reign, however, came in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh, where a grand alliance of Scots under Constantine II, Strathclyde Britons under Owain, and Norse Gaels from Dublin under Olaf Guthfrithson sought to unseat Ethelstan's growing dominance. Though the exact location of Brunanburh remains disputed, the battle was fierce and bloody, with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describing in poetic form the great slaughter of enemy kings and earls. Aethelstan won decisively, establishing his claim as legitimate ruler over not only the English but also the other people of the British Isles. While he did not annex Scotland or Wales outright, the submission of their rulers, even temporarily, elevated him beyond his predecessors. Aethelstan's administration brought unprecedented levels of centralization and bureaucracy, and his reach extended from Cornwall to the River Forth. Aethelstan's reign marked the first time that a single monarch exercised direct rule over all of England's constituent territories, despite the fact that he passed away in 939 without any heirs and that England would again split up after his death. Aethelstan's victory at Brunanburh, his conquest of York, and his assumption of royal titles that emphasized England as a unified whole distinguish him as the first true king of England, rather than a regional overlord or proto-monarch, according to scholars like Carl Shoemaker of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Even though Alfred laid the cultural foundation, and Egbert won short-lived hegemony, and Edward extended the realm militarily, it was Aethelstan who finally merged power, identity, and administration into something recognizably English. His achievements echo in the fact that after his reign, the idea of a united England endured even through Viking invasions, Norman conquest, civil war, and centuries of dynastic change because it had finally become something real, something lived, something centralized. As a result, the inquiry, who was the first king of England? Despite the fact that it may appear straightforward, it reveals centuries of conflict and cooperation, conquest and reform, inheritance and innovation, and both. While multiple contenders shaped what England would become, the evidence both administrative and symbolic ultimately points to Aethelstan, crowned in 925 AD and immortalized at Brunanburh, as the monarch who first forged England as a nation. Despite centuries of conflict, diplomacy, bloodlines, and cultural fusion, the truth about who was the first king of England is one of the most debated and fascinating questions in British history. The path to Aethelstan's coronation in 925 AD and the consolidation of the realm after the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD is layered with myth, manipulation, and numerous legitimate contenders for the crown, despite the fact that scholarly consensus today identifies him as the first true king of a unified England. To appreciate why Aethelstan holds that distinction, we must peel back the layers of pre-England history and examine the Germanic migrations, the fragmentation and fusion of the Heptarchy, the emergence of Wessex, and the violent resistance to Viking incursions that ultimately led to a centralized English monarchy. The name England itself originates from Engleland, land of the Angles-Germanic peoples who, along with the Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, arrived in waves during the 5th and 6th centuries after the Roman withdrawal. Their arrival marked the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period, and the disintegration of any lasting Romano-British political order. The 7 kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, Wessex, East Anglia, Northumbria, Essex, and Mercia comprised the Heptarchy at the beginning of the 600s, rather than a stable political confederation. These kingdoms were more cultural than geographical entities, with shifting borders and fluctuating influence. Leadership often emerged not by fixed territorial control but through charisma, military success, and loyalty from subordinate rulers. These early monarchs were known not by their dominion over England, a concept that did not yet exist, but by the loyalty of their followers and the reach of their alliances. An overlord whose supremacy was acknowledged by other kings was referred to as a Bretwalda in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which applied retroactively to several early rulers like El of Sussex and Edwin of Northumbria. However, even these powerful kings ruled over splintered regions marred by tribal and religious divisions. In particular, rulers like Offa r. 757 to 796, who famously constructed Offa's Dyke to separate his realm from the Welsh and issued coinage that bore remarkable resemblance to that of the Carolingian Empire, ruled the Kingdom of Mercia during the 8th century. Because of his continental diplomacy and influence over southern England, some historians suggest that Offa was the first king of England. However, Mercia's dominance waned, and King Egbert of Wessex emerged as a serious contender for the English throne following the Battle of Ellendun in 825. Egbert's victory over Mercia established Wessex as the dominant force in southern England. The chronicle lists Egbert as a Bretwalda, noting that other kingdoms submitted to his authority, but even this was likely more symbolic than concrete. Rather than relying on centralized control or administrative integration, his claim to the throne rested more on military conquest. Egbert's importance lies more in what followed, a relatively stable succession that allowed Wessex to maintain power and build continuity through hereditary rule, something Mercia had struggled to achieve. A succession of his sons, including Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, followed Egbert's death in 839 before Alfred the Great, the youngest of Egbert's grandsons, took the throne. Alfred's reign marked a turning point. He ascended in 871 AD during one of England's darkest hours, when the great heathen army and alliance of Viking raiders and settlers from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had overrun most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only Wessex wasn't taken back. Alfred's unlikely military victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 led to the Treaty of Wedmore and established a shaky peace that divided England. The south remained under Anglo-Saxon control, while the north and east became the Danelaw, an area ruled under Scandinavian laws and customs. However, Alfred's significance goes far beyond his military victories. In order to safeguard his shores, he reorganized the military and defensive infrastructure of Wessex by constructing fortified baths and launching a navy. By inviting scholars to his court and translating important Latin texts into Old English, he also started an intellectual renaissance that extended beyond Wessex. For these reasons, many argue that Alfred deserves the title of first king of England, or at least first king of a new kind of kingdom. By claiming to be king of the Anglo-Saxons and not just of Wessex, he meant to extend his power to the island's south. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, continued to drive the Vikings back, building on his father's successes. Alongside his formidable sister, Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, Edward retook lands from Danish control and extended Wessex's power into Mercia and East Anglia. By Edward's death in 924 AD, large swathes of what is now England were under his influence. His son Ethelstan, born around 894, succeeded him and is widely considered the first king to rule all of England. When Ethelstan was crowned in 925, he inherited a realm larger and more cohesive than any Anglo-Saxon king before him. He worked swiftly to consolidate it, establishing rule over Northumbria by 927, effectively bringing all English territories under his crown. But Ethelstan's rule was not unchallenged. He was up against internal rebellion and threats from the north. Constantine II of Scotland, Owain of Strathclyde, and Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin came together to oppose him in 937 and met Ethelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh. The resulting conflict was epic. Although the exact location of Brunanburh remains debated, some argue for Bromborough on the Wirral Peninsula. The battle's importance is undisputed. Chroniclers described it in apocalyptic terms, with 5 enemy kings and 7 earls slain. Ethelstan won and consolidated his power over a united England. For the first time, a single ruler had authority over the entirety of what we now consider England. He established a court that attracted both local and continental dignitaries and issued royal charters referring to himself as King of the English.